Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Here's what I propose to do. How many of you are in private business? Good. Community leadership. I know all of you are community leaders in a number of different directions. I'd like you to do one thing for me, which is keep that head on and that perspective on and voice it here. I know we're in a campus, and some of you may have memories of sitting in a classroom and there's a professor and you've got to listen. Life's too short. It's too bloody early in the morning, and you all know what it takes to succeed in your own business endeavors. I'd really like the hard questions. I'd like you to be thinking about the things that are relevant to your lives, to your businesses, what you do, what you're trying to accomplish, what you'd like to see your community accomplish. And if I can't answer those, I'm going to learn something. And the big secret about being a professor is that I get to essentially keep my head at least in school for my entire life. So I learn every day. If I'm missing something, that's an opportunity. So I'll make this run pretty quickly. I'd like to be through my presentation in about 25 minutes and leave us at least 15 minutes for question and answer. I'll be available afterward if any of you want to talk individually. And I'll just kind of leave it there. We'll move quickly. I want to give you an idea for the sorts of work that we do in the Sleep and Performance Research Center, and then the pieces that I do with my team in the simulation lab, which is a brand new only thing of its kind in the world from a research standpoint, that we've just gotten up and running thanks in part to the vision of people like Bryan and Dennis back there, who could see that this crazy idea about building a brand new kind of a lab to do a brand new kind of thing made sense and invested in. So far we're paying off. We'll keep it going. All right, so part of what I'll focus on has to do with police officer performance and the connections between fatigue and sleep and shift work. Those of you who have industrial operations deal with the same problems. Those of you in government deal with police officers, but also firefighters and a lot of other workers. Those of you who are on the other side of business, we had a conversation earlier this morning thinking about costs and benefits and investment issues with different sorts of endeavors. The connection between fatigue and performance has a great deal, I think, and we've got more and more evidence to show exactly what it has to do with those endeavors. One of the questions I hope I'll hear at the end is, well, what are the technical and the business opportunities to be played out in this arena? Because I'm not going to jump into that much in my talk. There are just too many, and it'd be better if I follow where you'd like to go with that, I think. All right, so the Sleep and Performance Center, of which my lab is a part, we do two different sorts of things traditionally. We study sleep and wakefulness and the lack thereof among people who are healthy. Some of you may have gone in for sleep studies into a sleep lab. That's a very different thing than what we run. We run a place where people can come and stay for a day or a week, or as long as you've got money to fund the research, or somebody does. And we study healthy asymptomatic people. We typically in the laboratory study them as in this very controlled environment. We also study them out in the field. Airline pilots, other transportation workers, people in an industrial setting, in a business setting, people in our field. Some of our colleagues are working with professional athletes, trying to find that extra performance edge that'll make a difference. My lab does something a little bit different in this traditional mix. There are about 5 laboratories in the country that do that sort of work. And that's all. Another 10 or 12 around the world. The goals that we've got here to try and identify what the effects are of sleep loss, long work hours, shift work, sleep disruption, jet lag, all of those things that you know from being tired. Maybe if you got up early this morning, you're feeling a little bit of it this morning or later on today. But we also want to find out how to mitigate those things. How do you help people deal with the effects of being tired? How do you help businesses identify the least harmful way to have people work 24/7, which is a very unnatural thing to do? How do you measure the risks and the benefits so that you can make an intelligent decision? And then at the very end today, I'm going to bring up a model that I think is important, and it's part of the social science piece of what I do as well as being a biological scientist, is to think a little bit deeper about how we measure those costs and benefits, some of the things that may be hidden from view right now and may be affecting our thinking in the wrong direction. So when you look at field versus laboratory research, just to give you a visual, you've got field things like a pilot here. This is our sleep laboratory right across the way. It's busy today is the only reason we can't follow this with a tour. We've got an occupancy rate running right around 90% right now. So business is good, but it makes it hard to do the outreach part that we'd like to do sometimes. We have 4 rooms, very comfortable. People stay in these rooms for, like I said, prolonged periods of time. While they're in, oftentimes while they're sleeping, they're wired up for polysomnography. If you've had a sleep study, I had one a couple years ago finally. My wife wouldn't put up with the snoring anymore. Turns out you can sleep with all that crap on. And while that's being done, we have research assistants sitting inside the control room over here, observing what's going on, monitoring it, measuring very deep aspects of what's going on inside the brain and neurologically, physiologically with the subjects. I try to do something just a little bit different. Here's the practical balance that you have between field research. Field research, you go out, you work with people in their occupational setting, but there's a lot going on. If you remember a physics laboratory, by golly, we're trying to control every single piece of that's going on so we can tell what effect something has on something else. The more noise you have around that environment, the more difficult it is to measure carefully the things you need to measure. So we have, in a sleep laboratory, very abstract measures of effects of sleep loss or deprivation or time of day on your performance. Things like a little device that you hit the target when it pops up. And we know from good, hard scientific research, this is a good way to measure how impaired you are. But going out to a room full of cops like I often do, or soldiers or astronauts or other folks, and saying, I want you to do this, and if you start to do less well, that means you're too tired to do a good job. Well, you get questions like, well, you know, I'm a Navy fighter pilot. And I understand all of this, and I've had all the training, but you know, when I'm landing that aircraft on a deck that's pitching up and down at 200 knots, miles an hour, I'm an old Marine, I never could remember what a knot is other than something you tie. I don't think that's going to affect me at all. Nobody falls asleep in a firefight is what you get from my old people. Well, but we do have some evidence that there are untoward effects, that there are decrements to performance. We just don't know how much. So measuring it in the field's tough. Measuring it in the laboratory is easier but hard to sell to people in the field. And so what I'm trying to do with my laboratory is bridge that connection. So what we have in the laboratory is simulation. Driving simulators are very high fidelity, wraparound screens. We can modify them for different environments. We can time things very carefully that happen, events that affect, that the driver has to deal with. And we get the driver more or less sleep deprived over time in the laboratory. It's in the same controlled laboratory. The paint on the walls the same color as inside the sleep lab. The overhead lights deliver exactly the same amount of illumination. Ceilings, everything is the same. But inside the laboratory, where we have the simulators, instead of being very quiet and keeping it all calm, we try and get some reality in there. So we're trying to bridge between the noisy environment of the field research and the highly controlled laboratory environment. Nobody's ever done this inside a laboratory. When people have used simulations in the past, they've either been poor approximation of something like driving on a laptop computer, for example, or they drag people across some military base to a flight simulator. Well, the problem is with sleep, when you take somebody out of that controlled environment, you affect their state, and it's introducing more noise in your research. So we have the driving simulators, and you'll notice Jason, one of our grad students, is wearing this funny-looking yarmulke. What it is an ambulatory electroencephalograph. So it's measuring, as someone's moving about the laboratory, what's going on in their brain. How much attention are they paying to things? How engaged are they? How often do they have lapses of attention? He's also wearing what looks like a muscle shirt, but is really a life shirt that captures data about respiration, heart rate variability, some other measures that we need to measure how awake, how alert, and how engaged someone is. Another one of our major simulations, and I'll show you some other pictures of this, is the Deadly Force Judgment and Decision-Making Simulator. Both of these simulators are the types of simulations that are being used extensively by the military, by police departments. More than 90% of the cops who are trained every year in the United States, and there are 800,000 of them, by the way, get trained in some sort of simulator. So we're taking the devices that they use to train their people to be in the field, and we're bringing them into a laboratory. We're adapting them painfully sometimes on our part so that we can get the kinds of precise measures we need out of them, and then using them for experiments. So one of the key experiments that's never been done is what's the impact of sleep and fatigue on human performance and decision making, not just while you're driving something, but while you're making the kinds of very quick, very deadly decisions about whether to use force, whether to shoot someone or not. Those decisions get chewed over in a courtroom for days and weeks and months, or years sometimes. In the field, they often happen in less than a minute. In a split second, the information comes in, it's ambiguous. A decision has to be made. How's that affected by sleep deprivation, by the kinds of hours that police officers work in the field? And then that in turn connects very well with what our military troops, especially on the ground, are dealing with right now in Afghanistan and Iraq. The heart of counterinsurgency warfare, if you've been listening to General Petraeus or any of the other military commanders or watching what's going on in the southern part of Afghanistan right now, is work among a civilian population, work with people, try to build relationships with them. While you're doing that, watch out, because some of them are going to try to kill you. When they do, neutralize them, but try not to hurt anybody else who happens to be around, and make that decision not at the command level with a general or a colonel or a captain or often even a lieutenant, but at the level where the folks with the high school degrees are out there, what they're calling a strategic corporal at a small unit level is making the decision, the same kinds of decisions that cops make. So we're working both for the military and for the Justice Department and for the transportation industry and the U.S. Department of Transportation to do these sorts of simulations that are very realistic. We're building into the lab, and this is something else never been done before, eye gaze analysis. We've got the devices. It's not easy to make them all work together because they each work off of different infrared signals and whatnot. But what an eye gaze analysis device does is it lets us tell when you're looking at what, when you moved on to the next thing you looked at, how long you looked at it. And so you can map this. In trying to understand someone driving, you can see the implications of that. With a deadly force situation, it's even more critical. How were you scanning, looking for threats? What were you paying attention to that would give you that split-second additional benefit of being able to respond and respond more accurately and more thoughtfully? And does that change when you're more or less tired? When you're more well-rested? Nobody knows. And this picture, which you didn't see here, you may see a National Geographic in the May issue. But this is a couple of Spokane police officers who work with us on some of the research that we do. This is one of the scenarios we've developed, which are also unique because they're absolutely realistic. They match all the data that we have on deadly force situations for cops. So we've built them ourselves, filmed them with professional actors here in Spokane. And people are excited. We have money right now both to build them but to evaluate them. So human performance, your ability to think, move, make decisions, behave precisely, control your behavior, all of these things is very, very difficult, both in a policing environment, in a military environment, and a number of other operational settings. If you're going to understand that performance, you have to have a laboratory environment that's reasonably controlled. If you're going to sell the results of that research to people who need to use it to make decisions or policies, then you have to have it be realistic, and that's what we're trying to bridge. We think that understanding performance is the key to survival on the streets, to safety on the streets, and to success of the missions we're trying to accomplish. Like I said, we're using realistic simulators, the ones that are used in real-world training, trying to improve the rigor, but also the validity of the research that we do in the Sleep and Performance Research Center, and help us translate that research into practice and into business opportunities as well, frankly. Like I said, only place in the world you can do this. We had some of the top sleep researchers from around the world out here last summer, and they were drooling, which is neat. Our subjects sometimes are naive subjects, people drawn from the general population who have no experience doing these sorts of things. Sometimes they're veteran police officers or recently trained police officers. Sometimes they're military combat veterans because we're trying to understand what it takes to perform well at these sorts of tasks. How do you make a deadly decision quickly enough to survive and be successful, and with enough precision and good judgment that you minimize the harm done to other people? You see this same problem. Our community is wrestling with this, has wrestled with it several different times over the last couple of years alone. We've got a number of those up and to deal with right now. So we focus primarily deadly force judgment, decision-making, driving. We're building communications tests. How well do you understand what you hear, pass it along, write reports? How accurately can you recall what happened in a deadly confrontation? What we want to do has to do with this triangle that's emerged as we've built the lab, frankly. We know that sleep has an impact on operational performance in lots of environments. We're trying to understand how it affects performance in these critical environments, such as cops, soldiers, Marines, but also probably firefighters, EMTs, and also the medical professions as we get additional funding to build what we're doing out. So we started out looking at this, because we're working with training simulators, one of the other pieces that's obviously there is to look at training and the effect of sleep on training. We've known for years that it's a bad idea to have people sleep deprived when they're trying to learn something. And if you learn something, you need to get enough sleep to integrate it into your overall understanding of the world. But you know, in these occupational groups, typically what we do is we sleep deprive the hell out of people while they're going through boot camp, basic training, an internship. And so we have some real questions, some questions that mean big money, because when you're training, typically you're not earning or doing something productive in a business sense. And then this last leg may seem counterintuitive to some of you. One of the problems that we have in policing in particular, and the military correlates of that and counterinsurgencies, we've been training people how to shoot better. We've been training them for more than 100 years. We've been training them how to survive and do better tactically since about the time I started as a street cop in 1969. We have no idea, we have no firm empirical evidence whatsoever of any impact of the training we do on how well people perform in actual combat situations. I can show you that we can improve their ability to punch holes in paper with a firearm, but we don't know anything. We have no hard evidence about what the impact is on their ability to make deadly force judgments and decisions. Those are very different from the kinds of decisions that people make in the normal world, where you have time to gather the information you need to weigh the possible consequences and choose one. This stuff happens quickly. So that's the practical real world piece. How many of you have heard Greg Belenke or Hans or one of my colleagues talk about sleep issues? All right, well, some of you have, some of you haven't. I'm going to run through very, very quickly and minimally what the issues are with sleep and fatigue. If you're here and you're successful, chances are you know how to work hard and you push yourselves lots of times. Maybe you go to Rockwood and have coffee regularly to keep you moving. We all do it, I do it. But there are consequences to this. The most basic piece of it has to do with the intrinsic rhythms of human beings. We have literally dozens of different rhythms of hormones and temperature and control systems inside our bodies. We're very complicated creatures. They've evolved over long, long periods of time. It's not natural for us to be up working at night. It's not natural for us to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep every single night. When you don't, there are consequences. I'm a traditionalist. I enjoy my, up to the late 18th century composers very well, and it fades down with the modern guys. When your body is sleep deprived, all those rhythms that have to happen together, you have body temperature over the course of the day varying. You have stress hormones, cortisol, over the course of the day, normal variation. Your growth hormones, while you're sleeping, are pumping up, especially when you're younger. All of those things control the rhythms of the body, and when you sleep deprive or disrupt the sleep, all of a sudden they're not entrained. If you've ever pulled an all-nighter and you go home and you shower and you wash up and you still feels like a caravan of camels walk through your mouth or something worse. Just that nasty taste, speaking of which. This is the wonderful symphony of the body. When everything's in train, it all works wonderfully, and it's a beautiful thing. Just like listening to an orchestra really doing well with one of my sorts of favorite composers. When they're not, it's like warm-up time, or some of my less favorite composers, where you get the atonalities, the conflicts, the clashes that are so frustrating and that impair your performance, that affect how you feel, that maybe even affect how you act. All right, so that's one of the foundations. Circadian rhythms, the rhythms across the day. Brains, all right, the most basic piece of neuroscience, your brain runs on two supplies. One of them is glucose, a simple sugar, to give it the energy to function at all. The other one is sleep. If you don't have enough sleep, two things happen. One, you get lapses in attention, and I'm going to take just a second to side note that in a moment. And the other is the quality of the signal in the brain starts degrading. That lapses of attention part matters. How many of you have ever been drowsy while you were driving? Felt sleepy? Yeah, thanks. All right, we got our honesty hats on. How many of you are dead because of it? Okay, that part empirically seems sound. Why? If you drink until you're so impaired, if you've been awake for 24 hours, you've got the level of impairment that's roughly equivalent to a blood alcohol at 0.10. It's about like drinking 4 shots of wild turkey for a man my size in an hour. That level of impairment, if you've been awake for 24 hours, yet that's not uncommon, especially among emergency workers of different sorts. How come they're not all running off the road? It's because the level of impairment's different with sleep. Sleep increases the probability you'll have a lapse. Just that blank spot where you're 100 yards or a quarter mile down the road, where you're not paying attention, you miss the off-ramp, where you're not seeing something. I'll give you some more examples later. But because sleep has the same overall level of impairment as alcohol consumption, but the difference between the two is that it's a probabilistic thing. Part of the time, it's okay. Part of the time, if you close your eyes and you're driving down the road, you can get away with it sometimes. We'll give you an example of somebody who didn't in a minute. Here's the other piece. Sleep doesn't affect the whole brain equally. It differentially affects, this is a PET scan, and so this is the frontal lobe of the brain up here. This is the part that makes us different from chimps. This is where the higher executive functions happen. This is where we think about consequences. This is where we apply complicated moral rules. This is where we make decisions about what to do and how to do it. It affects down deep in the core of the brain where we control mood and arousal, where we pause for a second, don't yell at that kid, or lose our temper and strike someone. That's another part that's seriously impaired by fatigue. I mean, one of my grad students way early on in this line of research when I was starting it up said, "You mean nobody ever noticed that tired cops get cranky just like everybody else? But they're cranky, tired people with guns." No, nobody ever noticed or paid attention to it. Also affects a part of the brain that controls between what you see and think about and what you actually do. So part of the extra bad news about this is the part of your brain that would say, "I'm tired, I'm sleep deprived," is also degraded. So we're lousy judges of how tired we are. Period. End of sentence. We can bury in the research, well established. So it's not just that you can't do as well, you don't know that you're impaired. I mean, you know, we all do know that sleep affects job performance. Let's just take a look at this for a second. Maybe not so dramatically. You know, if only that desktop hadn't been loose. Well, that's part of the problem, really, is this convergence of other things that leads us to tragedy with sleep. And I'll give you an example, like I said, in a couple of minutes. Let's look at it on the job with physicians. This is hard research. Our colleagues at Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital have done this work. If you change resident work hours from schedules that require them to work 24 more hours at a time, what you do is they get more sleep. That's not a big surprise. But I mean, they do take advantage of that increased time off. You have 50% fewer nighttime attentional failures at work, so failures that are associated with just not paying attention, not doing things with the diligence that you hope for when you're in the hospital and your life's on the line. 36% fewer of these serious medical errors, but they were observed by an experienced emergency room physician in that particular experience. So these are physicians who are just there watching what the residents do. 90% of the intern needle stick injuries, which are a big deal from a health and safety standpoint, attributed to fatigue in one way or another. Every time you worked one more 24-hour shift in a month, so fatigue has a longer effect on you than just tonight when you didn't get enough sleep, it increased the probability of a self-reported risk of a vehicle crash, a near miss or vehicle crash by about 10%, a little less. So every time you work one of these in a 1 month period, it cranks the odds up, not just for that night, but for consecutive nights. You don't get enough sleep tonight, it's bad. You keep running that sleep debt, it will get you. Let's look at cops on the job. I've been involved with all of these studies with different colleagues around. The kind of chronic sleep disruption that you normally see in policing is associated with high levels of cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, metabolic diseases, chronic insomnia, sleep apnea. So it adds to sleep apnea, which makes it hard to get a good night's sleep and get enough rest, and other sleep disorders, and also psychological disorders, depression, suicide, family dysfunction, all the things that are associated with high divorce rates among cops and other shift workers too. What we know from sleep research is that the sorts of short-term events that kill and injure most cops on the job are the ones that are very closely tied from other research on human beings to sleep issues and fatigue. I'll show you some evidence that direction. So here's the problem as you start thinking about it systematically. So fatigue reduces how attentive you are. It impairs your cognitive functioning, your physical functioning, worsens your mood, fuels then a vicious cycle. It reduces your ability to deal with stress. Stress makes it harder to get a good night's sleep, doesn't it? You're worried, you lose your perspective on things. Stress and fatigue working together then increase vulnerability to disease. Cops die an average of 6.5 years younger after retirement. In a study done by my colleague John Violante, another ex-cop went back and got a doctorate at the University of Buffalo. The police departments in this whole department, he stayed from 1950 to 1990, dying 6.5 years earlier than a matched sample of other municipal workers from the same city over the same years. So this is one look at the long-term impact of these things. But think about the problem inside the business of doing government. You get increased absenteeism. When I'm sick and I call in, we still have to fill in. If we do that, we have to pay overtime. It costs more. And that overtime then for somebody else disrupts their sleep and causes more fatigue. So you get this vicious cycle that goes. And the long-term consequence of it are things like obesity, fatigue, metabolic disorders, cardiovascular. I mean, does that look like anybody you've ever seen? That's not all body armor under that shirt. Let's look at the causes of vehicle crashes for cops and the general public. You know, the first one, speed. speed, 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 going too fast. The second one, not paying attention. When those two things converge, so does a tragedy. There's a police officer in Northern California in late 2008. I'm still stuck in the last century. I'll let you read it for yourself. So it's 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning. This deputy is driving up Stevens Canyon Road. The road turns to the right, and he doesn't. And he goes right into a swarm of bicyclists in their funny little spandex suits swarming down the hill, and kills two. You can see a bit of bicycle protruding here. Just what that is a very good indication of the sorts of problems that happen with these lapses of attention due to fatigue. If the road had gone straight, if the bicyclist hadn't been there, or if the lapse had occurred at another moment in that long drive up that canyon, he would have got away with it. All right.
Wasn't there somebody last year, a woman officer that took out a bunch of parked cars and
Sure.
make the news anyway?
Yeah, happens all the time. I mean, I collect the ones I can and get called on quite a few of them for news media. It's, fall asleep. When you look at what kills police officers, it's a great segue. I didn't really plan it with Karen, but let's look at what kills cops right quick. So 1980, 2008, which is the most recent data, the blue line, and this is per capita. So out of how many 100,000 police officers there are in the US, and there were in 1980 compared to now. This is the blue line are the deaths that are on duty that are associated with accidental causes of one sort or another. That little faint line you see through it's a regression line that gives us an idea about where's the average. Well, it's declining a bit, which is nice news, but it's only declining a couple of percent. Most of those accidental deaths are associated with traffic collisions of one sort or another. Some of you have been around as long as I have. Have vehicles changed much since 1980? We've got disc brakes, radial tires, airbags, suspensions that would have been a dream on a sports car or a racing car in that era, and yet you've just got a tiny little decrease in how much cops are getting killed per capita this way. You'll notice that from that time, this is pretty much when we started doing tactical and survival training for cops. Accidents have always been a big deal. We've done some good with regard to fatalities, felonious killings, the shootings that you think about, that you always see that the public gets justifiably so upset about. We've had some impact on them. We've got body armor, we've got better training, we've got better tactics, we've got better communications gear, all of those things. There's another line up here that ought to, and I've only got these data because they're collected by the Centers for Disease Control, and they ran out of funding for collecting these particular data on public safety officers. These are suicide data for police officers over these years, and you see the same pattern. This is roughly the rate of military combat suicides that we've been seeing among ground forces in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 8 years. 5 years just seems longer. Causes: shift work, long and irregular work hours, overtime, off-duty court appearances. Cops have to show up no matter whether the case goes or not. It usually doesn't. And they moonlight a lot. And nobody collects data on how much they moonlight. We just know there's a lot of it. Job stress, not enough sleep, scheduling that ignores sleep and circadian issues. People don't think about the medical implications of different times of day to go on and off duty, for example. And then the personal choices people make which makes it a thorny, a lot of you are managers. This means this is a management side of the equation, the things you can do to change what conditions are on the job. Some of this, though, has to do with what the person does in their own time off the job. So we have some strategies that are working. We've almost changed the way work hours go in Canada for police. But it's a tough problem. It takes some real thinking. 41% of the cops in the country sleep poorly. This was a study I published in 2000. Since then, we've gotten 3 more studies, same results, different populations, different parts of the country. So you've got a large proportion of police officers who don't get good quality sleep at all anyway. And when you look at this over the long term, I won't go through this in detail, but it threatens different organ systems, the heart, the pancreas, impairs your immune system when you're chronically sleep deprived, increases risk of obesity. You get more of the hormone that says, give me cheap, I want that Snickers bar and I want it now. And you get less of the hormone that suppresses the appetite. Risk of type 2 diabetes up, all the things we know. All right, so let me bring this home, and I'd like to bring it in with a model of thinking about this that no one's used before. This will be out later this year in the new edition of Principles and Practices in Sleep Medicine. A colleague and I worked this up. Greg Belenke, who's the head of our center, has got a whole section in that medical text that's the Bible for sleep medicine on occupational medicine. There's never been an occupational sleep medicine specialty at all before, and it's one of the things we're pioneering here. So look, you've got rhythms across society, right? Time of day, you've got more people on the street, more demands for services, different things going on in your community, depending on time of day, day of week, season of the year. And you try and meet those services that fluctuate. Here we're talking about cops, but you could easily make this physicians or a number of other occupational groups, certainly. We try to meet that and balance it, and the more we just have enough people to do the job, the more efficient we are. Makes good sense. Here's a piece we tend not to think about. If you don't have enough people, you have understaffing, the problem usually is met with overtime, and we figure, okay, it costs me time and a half, but I don't have to pay more fringe benefits. There's a point where I can push, and it makes sense to pay overtime instead of hire more people. But understaffing also leads to overwork and job stress. And those affect, on the one hand, a person's resiliency, their ability to bounce back from that long shift or that domestic problem or changing the time of day that they work. The things that let you be flexible and take what life deals and deal with it. It also affects health and wellness. Okay, the classic triangle in medicine is nutrition, physical activity, what's going on in your domestic life, and sleep as what affects your health and wellness over time. If you think about this, someone who's less well, less resilient, are they capable of doing the same job at a demanding job? I think not. We'll see when we get the evidence in as we do more of this work. I think that what we need to do to think about this is think from the community and from the social ecology of this problem up through the human physiological aspects of it, the management and staffing pieces, because if you're overworking and stressing your people, gradually what seems likely to happen is that the effective power of your workforce, the amount they can bring to the job, diminishes. Right now what we do is we say we got X number of people on the job. Okay, that's what we go for. That's not always the only issue. And if we can develop ways of dealing with this, like we're trying to do with the mathematical modeling side of the work we do at the lab, I think we can find much better ways to measure efficiency in the workplace both for public employees and private employees.
I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the aging of America and Alzheimer's disease. As you all know, America is aging. By the year 2030, 1 in 5 Americans, or 20% of our population, is going to be over the age of 65. The fastest growing segment of our population is the 80-plus age range. And this aging of America is going to bring with it some significant healthcare challenges. One of those biggest challenges is how we're going to care for the increasing number of individuals with Alzheimer's dementia. Alzheimer's dementia is a disease that increases with age. Currently, about 5.2 million Americans suffer from Alzheimer's dementia. And if no cure is found by 2050, it's estimated that 16 million Americans, with 8 million of those being in the age group 80 plus, will suffer from Alzheimer's dementia. Currently, the cost of skilled nursing home care is about $70,000 a year. And the Lewin Group estimates that by 2050, if no cure is found for Alzheimer's dementia, Medicare spending could reach $1 trillion. A lot of care is being done at home by family members and friends, and that actually saves the US economy about $144 billion a year. This is according to 2009 statistics. But we do know that caring for someone with dementia does bring significant economical, social, psychological, and physiological risk. So data suggests that care partners who are caring for an individual with Alzheimer's dementia are at higher levels of emotional stress and physical health problems in comparison to other caregivers of other types of diseases and to non-caregivers. So in terms of thinking about interventions or ways to assist individuals who are having cognitive difficulties, it's important to also keep in mind the care partner. So the current intervention that we've been working on is a cognitive rehabilitation multifamily group intervention. And the goals of this intervention are to delay and compensate for the functional disability in the person who's having cognitive difficulties, to boost the care partner's confidence and competence, so it's important to us to work with both members of the care dyad, and then to enhance the care dyad's interpersonal relationships, coping skills, and quality of life. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of our intervention, where it came from. The new medical guidelines for Alzheimer's disease now recognize a continuum of phases. The first being a preclinical phase, where there's changes occurring in the brain, but we're not so much seeing them in terms of cognitive difficulties with memory or thinking abilities, or in people's abilities to function on an everyday basis. There's a transition phase after the preclinical phase called mild cognitive impairment. And this is the group of individuals that we've been working with. These are individuals who are starting to show some difficulties, having problems with memory, having problems with thinking skills. They're still able to function independently, although there are problems with some more complex activities of daily living, such as managing finances or cooking complex recipes. And many of these individuals will go on to transition to Alzheimer's dementia. And when they're given the diagnosis of dementia, this is the point where they're having difficulties functioning independently in their everyday lives. Now, the fact that in the last couple decades, we've been able to recognize or diagnose people earlier in this mild cognitive impairment phase has opened up new ways to think about interventions. So before, typically what was done, the Alzheimer's individual was put in a group in one room, and the caregiver was put in a group in another room. And these individuals were worked with different therapists because there were different needs that were involved. Well, being able to diagnose people earlier in this period of mild cognitive impairment opens up the ability to work with both members of the care dyad together. These individuals are aware that they're having difficulties, and most of them are very interested in being proactive, finding strategies that they can put in place to assist them as the cognitive skills start to decline. So another thing about being able to work with people in the mild cognitive impairment stage is that we can be more proactive. We don't have to react to the symptoms, but we can actually start putting things in place. In terms of the development of this intervention, I had done some earlier work with people with traumatic brain injuries, with teaching them how to use an external aid, a memory notebook. And then we decided that we wanted to try some of this work with people with mild cognitive impairment, and we wanted to bring their spouses in as a support partner in terms of learning these strategies. So our early work was a 7-week intervention with 6 couples. They met twice a week for 2 hours, and we taught them how to use the memory notebook as an external aid, as well as other sorts of memory strategies that they could start putting in place in their everyday lives. We also teach from a more holistic point. So how can you use the memory notebook to also increase positive things like social networking, exercising, things that are going to support quality of life. And one of the things that I like about the memory notebook as a cognitive strategy is that it can help people plan for future events. So just like the daily day planners that many of you use, it can help people get to appointments. It can help them plan to do today list and then schedule those in. But it can also help people who are having significant memory difficulties look back and see what they had done on previous days. So we also teach them how to journal events that are occurring either hourly or at breakfast, lunch, or dinner into their memory notebook so that they have some sort of record of what it is that they've been doing that they can refer back to. So our early intervention group, we did find that our care partners were reporting decreased depressive symptoms after the intervention. For individuals with MCI, we found that they felt more confident that they could go to family members and friends and ask for support. We didn't know whether this was the memory notebook intervention or some of the social support that they were receiving from the group, because as it turned out, that social support was a very important factor that they were continuously speaking with us about too. We found that they were using more memory strategies in their everyday life, as self-reported by some diary measures. We also found that on laboratory tests where we allowed note-taking, that they were taking notes, they were referencing their notes, and they were demonstrating to us that they had acquired these strategies and were able to apply them. One of the things that we didn't find was changes in self and significant other report of everyday memory lapses and of being able to do more activities of daily living independently, more complex activities. And of course, one of the things that we want to be able to show is that this intervention is significantly helping people in their everyday lives. Now, there are some issues with how really is the best way to measure outcome in terms of everyday performance. So that may be one thing that unfortunately hinders research in this area because we just don't have a lot of good methodologies. But another thing that we were left with was really how can we make sure that they're transitioning what we're teaching them in our treatment into their everyday lives. So you all know that it's easy to talk about wanting to use a new strategy, but it's really difficult to actually take that strategy and start using it on a daily basis in your everyday life. So we began to ask the question of how can we get these memory strategies integrated into the everyday lives of the care dyads? And in speaking with Dennis and doing some research and seeing what happened in our first group, we came to the idea that perhaps we could do this by combining our cognitive rehabilitation with multifamily group psychoeducation. So what is the multifamily group treatment? Well, it's a psychoeducation management strategy that's designed to help families cope and manage symptoms of medical disorders. So it's come out of work with schizophrenia patients, and Dennis has adapted it to other medical patients, spinal cord and traumatic brain injury. 6 to 8 families work together with 2 clinicians, and it's actually a lengthy intervention, so it's over a period of many months to years. And the multifamily group treatment has a strong psychoeducational and counseling component, and it also has an interactive real-world problem-solving component. And this was one of the aspects that was important to us in terms of helping them develop plans and actually implement those plans in their everyday lives in terms of how to get these strategies into their everyday lives. Learning in the multifamily group provides an opportunity for group members to learn from each other. And families report not feeling so isolated, feeling connected with other people who are going through similar sorts of experiences, and then the opportunity to be connected with more professionals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our combined intervention now looks like and some of our preliminary data. To date, we have had 10 care dyads participate in our treatment group and 10 care dyads who are in standard care. So our standard care is just the typical medical intervention that they would receive. You can see the average age of our MCI participants is about 70 years old. Right now, we're having some issues with our randomization because we have more females in our intervention group, and their education is a little bit lower than those in our standard care group. You can also see some information about our care partner group. So here's a little bit about the study structure. We do pre-assessment with both standard care and individuals in treatment. It involves neuropsychological evaluations and blood draws. So one of the other things that we're interested in is physiological health markers. So we're looking at some biomarkers, some cytokinins, that may allow us to look at whether we're decreasing stress levels at a physiological level in both individuals with MCI and their care partners, in addition to our behavioral data. For those who are in the treatment study, the structure reflects what comes out of the multifamily group intervention. So first, there are some joining sessions with the care dyads where the clinicians meet with each member of the care dyad and get to learn about their strengths, their interests, their skills, what their current needs are, the impact that the memory difficulties are having in their everyday life. Then we have a psychoeducational workshop. That's a half-day workshop where we talk with them about mild cognitive impairment and dementia. We pique their interest in the intervention. We expose them to the other members of the group and start that social networking. Then the 10-week treatment intervention starts. We meet twice a week for 10 weeks for 2 hours. And some of you who have done clinical work are probably saying, oh, that's a lot. Or do people actually come? And I can tell you that people actually come and they do not like to miss it. We have almost 100% attendance.